Thank you very much for coming in. We'll let the stragglers straggle in, and we'll acknowledge with great gratitude the two doorkeepers who are keeping the door up there. I'd like to also acknowledge and recognise that we are on Ngunnawal country, and we wish to pay our respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that they have not ceded the land on which we are sitting to ourselves, and we are here as their guests. I'd also like to acknowledge the universe, and I'd like you all just to take a moment to feel your connection to the other people in the room and to the fabric of the room itself, and to take your imagination outside the room and just become aware of your connection to the stars and the plants and the trees and the planet. I'd like to acknowledge also our sponsors, the Public Health Association of Australia, Australian Capital Territory branch, thank you, the Ecology and Environment Special Interest Group, and the Primary Healthcare Special Interest Group, who are helping to fund Trevor's trip around Australia. And I'd also like to thank the Frank Fenner Foundation for their contribution, and particularly Jane Olsen, who's done a lot of the background work in making this happen, booking the theatre and all those logistical things which need to happen to make an event like this occur. So thank you, Jane. And finally, I'd like to introduce Trevor, who's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have some Q&A and time, because there's a relatively small number of us, and so if people up the back want to come down the front a bit, we could have more of a conversation when we get to that part of the evening. So Trevor is, he works at the School of Public Health and Social Policy at the University of Victoria in Canada, British Columbia. His job is thinker. That's what he does, thinker and writer. And presumably there's a bit of reading happens in there too. He's a public health physician and consultant. He's got a long-standing interest in the connections between health and the environment, and between health, the environment and sustainable development, and in the ecological determinants of health. Because along with the social determinants of health, if we don't have a functioning ecosystem, we don't have a healthy society. He has helped establish over time the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment and the Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare. He helped establish the Green Party in Canada and was for a time a Green member in the Parliament. And he has been very active in founding the Global Healthy Cities and Communities movement. And he's struggled and worked hard to put health on the agenda across a whole lot of sectors in society. And finally, most recently, he's been very busy in leading the Canadian Public Health Association's working group to develop a major report and initiative on the ecological determinants of health, global change and the public health. And it's out of that report that he's going to talk tonight. So Trevor, welcome very much.
Oh, yes, it is working. So, thank you for the invitation. I'm on a 5-city tour, actually. I started in Hobart, and I was in Melbourne, and then I go on to Sydney and Brisbane, carrying this same message around. I actually, be nice to do a tour in Canada, but that hasn't happened yet. But it's always the way. You're never a prophet in your own land. And as a consultant, I've seen that a lot. So, as Peter said, I'm going to be talking largely about and out of this report. Now, before I start, let me just get a quick handle on the room. So how many people here work in the field of public health? Okay. And how many people here work in the field of environment or ecology? Okay. Who else do we have in the room? Who works in neither of those?
Agriculture, food production.
Food production.
So is the first one, retired young practitioner.
Okay.
Peace campaign. Auditor.
Okay, so a nice mix. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about this report. The title here may seem a slightly strange one, but this is basically a version of the presentation I gave at the Public Health Congress in Hobart last week. And I was in a plenary session that was called Grand Challenges and Wicked Problems. And I decided that I should up the ante a bit and claim that this issue is in fact the grandest challenge and the wickedest problem. It's the grandest. What is the grandest challenge? The grandest challenge is, how do we do this? How do we all live together with a decent quality of life and in good health, and I would add in an equitable way, on this one small planet that Peter suggested we connect with? And then the wickedest problem? The wickedest problem is, what will we have to change in order to do this? Because the answer to that is pretty much everything. So it's a huge challenge that we face. It's a huge problem in getting from here to there, assuming we can even agree on where there is. So this is part of or this presentation stems from this project. And the project started 3 years ago. It took us 3 years to do it, partly because it's a big project and partly because we're all doing it off the side of our desks, and so it just takes a while to make that happen. We wanted to do really three things. We wanted to document potential health impacts of major global ecological change, and by global ecological change we meant these four big categories of change, to which we might actually, I suppose, add ocean acidification, although it's really, in a sense, a result of global pollution. We also then wanted to identify the drivers of these changes. So these changes are happening, and our intent in our report, incidentally, and our focus for the report is on the public health profession. And it's really important at the outset to be clear that public health has been largely absent from this debate. There are exceptions to that, and Tony McMichael was an obvious and stellar exception to that, and those who work with him and follow in his footsteps. But largely, if you like, the establishment of public health and the profession as a whole has been absent from the business of ecological sustainability, sustainable development, and all that goes with that, and understanding environmental health, other than in terms of toxics and food safety and noise and so on. So we've had a rather narrow version of this and have not been, if you like, at the party for the last 30 or 40 years. And in fact, I have been telling public health people for a very long time that the environmental movement has been doing our job for the last 30 or 40 years in drawing attention to the health impacts of these ecological changes, both locally, regionally, and globally. And so, as public health, we're not in a position to come to this party very late and then start saying, as we tend to say, we know what we need to do, and we're going to tell you how to do it because we're public health. So that's not the stature, it's just the opposite. And in fact, a lot of our focus and a lot of the report we spend laying out the case to public health as to why this stuff is really important and why it matters. And then we move on to identify what's driving that, which is social and economic change largely, and proposing an action agenda. I'm going to spend a bit more time on the action agenda end of it because I think it's important for people both in public health and outside of public health to understand what public health needs to do. And another really important point here is that our focus is on what does public health need to do, looking internally to a large extent. If we don't get ourselves organized around these issues, if we don't understand them, if we don't bring them on board as part of what is our mandate and our work, then how are we going to convince anybody else that it's important if we're not recognizing that and acting that way in the first place? So a lot of our agenda has to do with an agenda for public health action. What are we going to do to get us there? So these are the two reports that are out there at the moment. The one on the left is a discussion document put out by the Canadian Public Health Association as a process to start the discussion of these issues. And on the right, this is the technical report, or a short version actually. It says brief report. It's 100 pages. That's the brief report. Behind this lies another document which is 350 or so pages, which we haven't yet done a final edit on, and we're just starting that process now and are committed to having it done by the end of this year. That lays out this sort of scientific case behind all of this, the evidence, and so on. Both of those are available if you simply go to the CPHA website. They're not published other than online, and you can go to the CPHA website, cpha.ca, and you will find both the policy document and the background document. There are a large number of authors of this, and I want to recognize them and all the work they did. So in addition to myself as a lead author and editor, Colin Siskolny, whom some of you may know, who has been back and forth here quite a lot and worked here with Tony McMichael and others. Margot Parks, I just recognize she's originally a Kiwi, now works up in northern British Columbia on watersheds and health, past president of the International Eco-Health Association, and so she's very embedded in this work, and a lot of others. And so different chapters had different authors. At the same time, there's been another report, which I'm not going to spend time on, which comes from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Lancet. And I just want to flag that this too is out there, and in fact I was one of the external reviewers for this report. It came out of Richard Horton, who is the editor of The Lancet, attending a couple of years ago the Rockefeller Foundation's 100th anniversary event in China. That's where they chose to hold it, where they wanted not only to look back at 100 years of what they'd done, but more importantly, look forward 100 years to what was their agenda for the next 100 years. And Richard Horton proposed this concept of planetary health, and meaning how do we, and his concern is that global ecological change is threatening civilization. I was struck by the little statement here in the Fenner Foundation: the survival of civilization and the well-being of humankind in the future will require big changes in the patterns of human activity on Earth. That is almost verbatim what Richard Horton was saying in suggesting this idea of what he called planetary health. And so there was a commission that included a number of people around the planet who came together to put this together fairly quickly, actually, and it was released in July. And not only was I an external reviewer, but we gave them a draft version of our report, which came out in May, so that there's some synchronicity between the two. So I just recommend that you also take a look at that report if you have the time. So I'm going to talk about these things. Some of these, the first part of this, I'm really going to talk about quite quickly, because I'm going to assume that this audience doesn't need a lot of information about the ecological changes we face. But I want to push on fairly quickly into points 5 through 8 and talk about those as what are the health implications. A piece on imagination and hope. We have an entire chapter on imagining a better future, and we have another entire chapter on finding hope, because we think it's really important. These are pretty depressing things to face, and if we simply said, oh, here's a huge problem, no idea what we're going to do to fix it, and we're pretty pessimistic, now please go and do something, it doesn't really motivate people. So in the presentation and in other settings I've used, how many of you must have seen that little 3-minute Welcome to the Anthropocene video? Anybody not seen it? If you haven't seen it, just Google it and take a look at it. Very quick little clip that puts it all together really nicely. basically the Anthropocene is a new geologic epoch because we're having such a massive impact on the Earth that our footprint will be apparent millennia and millions of years into the future. You'll be able to point at a layer in the rock in the future and say that was the beginning of the Anthropocene. So that's how big an impact we're having. And so this is why we talk about this in terms of population health or public health in the Anthropocene. Recognize the massive changes. And so we talk in the report, we actually start our report with a lot of a short but important section about systems thinking and about understanding planetary systems, because by and large public health is not very systems oriented. It's quite linear and mechanistic, and we really need, now there's work happening in epidemiology around infectious disease in particular, and areas such as obesity where complex systems and systems thinking are coming in, but still it's largely linear and mechanistic, and that's not going to work. And so we have to think about and understand ecological processes and some of their implications. So the second thing really is that the dialogue on the determinants of health in population and public health, which our modern incarnation of what we're calling population health, largely began out of work by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research in the early 90s. And if you read their foundational book called Why Are Some People Healthy and Others Not?, you will not find any reference in there to ecology, ecosystem, nature. It was, we said at the time, population health was ecologically blind and has basically remained largely ecologically blind. So it's very focused on the social determinants of health, and that has become the focus. And so we had a WHO commission, a global commission, on the social determinants of health, touched on sustainability, but didn't really go into it. And it's not really been taken on board within population health. So we feel very strongly that we actually have to rebalance that we're kind of looking at population health with one eye shut, and we need to open that other eye, and we also need to understand that the ecological and the social are intimately interrelated, that social and economic change are driving ecological change, but the ecological changes will feed back negatively on social and economic conditions, and therefore both of those will then impact on human health, and you'll see the model later on that we're using to represent that. So the ecological determinants of health, they're pretty fundamental. You know, it's kind of hard to get by without air, water, and food for very long, or to have low and inadequate supplies of those. But also, and you will recognize in here the so-called ecosystem goods and services idea, which of course is a very anthropocentric idea that says, you know, nature has produced all this bounty for us to use. Well, that's not true. And we actually have to share it with other species as well, or else actually we may be in trouble if we don't share it with other species because we depend on them. So air, water, food, fuel and materials, protection from UV radiation, you know all the list, there's a long list that goes on, waste recycling, detoxification, and a stable climate. I think what's really important is to understand that this is not a discussion simply about climate change. It's about all of these things changing all at the same time, often interacting. And so we're trying to get that point across to the public health world. So in terms of what key ecological changes are underway, it's more than climate change. It's these four big things that I flagged earlier. So many of you will be familiar with, and in fact this morning earlier had a chance to sit down and have a chat with Will Stephan about this work and about the public health implications of this. But many of you will be familiar with the work of Will Stephan and colleagues, the idea of crossing planetary boundaries. And this is pretty disturbing stuff when you recognize that in their estimation we already are past a couple of planetary boundaries and approaching danger areas in others. So the red is sort of beyond the zone of uncertainty and in the area of high risk, and the yellow is increasing vulnerability. So in a number of key ecosystem processes, we're already at or approaching at or beyond planetary boundaries. And of course, the health implications of that are profound. And two in particular that have been identified and that we're approaching or crossing: climate change and biosphere integrity. But then on top of that, and we spend some time talking about this in the report, there's the threat of state shift, that in complex systems you can get non-linear rapid state shift. And you really don't want to hit any of those tipping points, because if you do, it's way too late to do anything to go back and change it. And the problem is, of course, you have no idea where the tipping point is till you hit it, really. So how do we, can we identify ahead of time tipping points? Can we avoid approaching them? Or are we going to have to deal with them if they crop up? It's hard to tell. And so there's examples of these tipping points that we may be approaching, particularly around climate change, but also clearly we're already into a sixth great extinction. The rate of extinctions, as many of you will know, is way above the sort of background level. So we're already into a lot of this. We're already into, and have been for some time actually, since the 1970s, exceeding the planet's biocapacity. And you'll be familiar with the ecological footprint, so I'm not going to spend time on that. But we spend some time in the report exploring the implications of that. Similarly, the Living Planet Index, the 52% decline in vertebrates, if you like, health, and populations, the health of populations of vertebrates, 52% down in 40 years globally. This is from the Living Planet report, which the World Wildlife Fund puts out every 2 years. This is from the most recent one, 2014, takes it out to 2010. And note that on the right, it points out in Latin America, this is actually an 83% decline in the Living Planet Index. At what point do we hit collapse? It's hard to say, but it can't, this is looking very grim. And then, of course, there are the human driving forces behind all that, and we've looked for simple ways to present this stuff to public health without going into, we do go into quite a lot of detail, but we've also looked for simple ways to present it. And this particular equation, or it's not really an equation, that's an exaggeration, but this way of understanding, which goes way back to Epstein and so on, back in the 70s, or was it the 60s, I'm not sure. Impact equals population times affluence times technology. And what's important here, and that's why I like this diagram, if you look in the front corner of the box at the bottom, you can see what the numbers were in 1900, what they were in 1950, and then this massive increase since 1950 in population, in affluence, and in technology. And this is what Will Stephan and others have called the Great Acceleration in both ecological changes and social changes. And it's those rapid social and economic changes and population growth changes that are driving ecological change. And so you get a great acceleration in social and economic forces, resulting in a great acceleration in environmental impact. And that impact, we tried to present that impact fairly simply for our audience, using a measure that is common in public health, which is life expectancy. And we talk a lot about life expectancy, although I think often it is overlooked that life expectancy is not predictive. That life expectancy although we talk about life expectancy at birth for an infant born this year is 80 years, that's actually a complete fabrication. Because it would only be true if that infant experienced throughout their life exactly the same average life conditions as all of the people who died this year, because life expectancy actually measures, it's a complicated way of measuring average age of death this year. So life expectancy is going up, but supposedly, or it is in some places. But if you took roughly the average lifespan these days is around 80 in the high-income countries or more. An infant born this year is going to live 80 years, presumably or supposedly. What changes will they see in their lifetime? Well, that's what they'll see. If you had quite a modest rate of population growth, this is approximately what we have today, it's about 1.1% globally, and 3% annual growth in real GDP, which is what the economists and the industrialists and governments are all busy chasing. What does that translate into? Over 80 years, it translates into a 23-fold increase in impact. Clearly, that's not sustainable. And even if our technology got a whole lot more efficient, 5 times more efficient than it is right now, you'd still have a greater than 4-fold impact. So it's important to understand that even these small, seemingly small changes over simply one lifetime will have a massive impact. And that's also approximately 3 generations. So all of that is to say that indeed there are limits to growth, and Graham Turner has published in a report through CSIRO in 2008 and then updated in 2014, looking at the Club of Rome predictions or modeling from 1972 when they published the limits to growth, the MIT group. And what no one had done until he did this in 2008 was to go back and say, well, let's look at what's actually happened since that modeling. And of course, it's compared to what we can do today, relatively crude modeling. I mean, this was 40 years ago. If you look at what's happened and compare the different tracks, different scenarios that they explored, it tracks pretty well for what was called the business as usual, BAU scenario. And when you look back again in 2014, quite recently, same thing. It aligns well with historical data. So we're on that BAU pathway, and that's the one which predicted a substantial collapse of the global ecosystem economy during the mid-21st century, which is still 35 years away. It's more than a generation away. But we appear to be on track for that. The public health implications of that are beyond scary. If economies and societies and civilizations start collapsing. I'm just going to skip very quickly through this. But I just think it's worth flagging. We have a tendency to say, well, let's go out and save the planet. Well, actually, we don't need to save the planet. The planet's been here 4 billion years. It's not going away. The planet's fine. We don't need to save the planet. We don't need to save life on Earth. It's survived 5 great extinctions. We're unlikely to wipe out life on Earth. Oh, we could, but it's unlikely. The human species, we're not likely to wipe out the human species, not in the near future anyway. We're a tough and resilient bunch, and we've been through worse. But it's not going to be pretty, whatever does happen. So it's not planet or Earth, life on Earth, or humans even. But, and this goes back to the point that Richard Horton's concerned about, that the Frank Fenner Foundation's concerned about, whether our societies and our civilizations will survive is what's in question. And the public health implications of that are profound. And that's the message we're trying to get across. So what are some of those health and human development impacts? The trouble is, and we looked around at the literature and we would agree with what this group said back in 2007, there hasn't been a lot of good work done, and it's still a struggle. And it's a struggle partly because the research funds aren't there to support doing this work. But we need to get a much better grip on what may happen. Of course, what we're dealing with here is what's been called anticipatory epidemiology. I mean, epidemiology is a really good science when you have bodies to count. It's really good at counting bodies and turning that into useful data. It's really good at counting diseases and so on. But we're here, what we're talking about is projections of what might happen or will happen. More complex, more difficult, less certain. But what they say here is true, And that's why we're doing this work in population and public health. That there's been a little recognition that all of these changes that we're experiencing pose risks, significant risks to health and well-being. That's why the determinants of health folks, the population health folks, kind of missed this 30 years ago, and why we're still struggling. What we do know is sketchy, it's preliminary, it's often speculative. But what we also know is that the health impacts of one form of global ecological change are probably going to be multiplied by the health impacts of another global ecological change. And so the whole system is changing, and all of those different components, and that spells out potentially bad news. And we really don't want to wait around until we do have bodies to count. That's not a useful exercise for us to be able to say, oh, look, we were right. That's not where we want to be. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005 was clear about the extent to which ecosystem services, as they put it, are being degraded or used unsustainably, and they concluded that the ability of the planet's ecosystem to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted. And that was in 2005. That was 10 years ago. It hasn't gotten better since then. So these are very real threats to the health of population. And as I said earlier, the environmental movement, if I can call us that, recognized this a long time ago and has been acting on it and trying to draw people's attention to it. Public health has not been there. And I know from all the times that I've worked with the environmental movement and various organizations that they would welcome public health, because they need public health to be there with them to say, yeah, this is a public health issue, these are the implications, these are the impacts on public health, this is why we need to take it seriously, and so on. It will bolster their case, and they really welcome public health in, and that's something we stress. The Rockefeller Foundation, in their report, I thought put it really nicely when they wrote this at the introduction. We've been mortgaging the health of future generations. Because you see, one of the problems is, one of the first criticisms we get, and I've heard this criticism so many times in the last 20 or 30 or more years, is, well, what are you worrying about? Life expectancy is increasing. Our kids are going to live longer. Which is, of course, failing to understand how we measure life expectancy and what it is, but it is a criticism and a pushback we get all the time. What are you worrying about? Life expectancy is increasing, we're doing fine. What they have said is we are increasing our life expectancy by depleting the very things that future generations will require for their life. And so we're mortgaging the health of future generations to realize economic and development gains in the present. And I think it's a very useful way to think about it. So our ultimate message is this in our report, that the population health impacts of these ecological determinants of health are large. We can't tell you how large, but they're large. They are at least comparable to the social determinants of health, potentially much bigger, actually. And that these two systems interact, and that we cannot continue to be ecologically blind, and what we have to do is take an eco-social approach to this. So there is a fairly gloomy place to end, and so that's why we didn't end there. We need to go on and think about imagination and hope. I've always liked this. My friend Clem Bezold, I'm a health futurist too, and I've done a lot of work with Clem, and he once said vision is values projected into the future. So we need to create a vision of the future society we want. And that vision is actually a reflection of our current values, which goes to the second point by another noted futurist, James Robertson, who I've also worked with, an English futurist. And he made the point that thinking about the future is of enormous relevance to today. And you have to think about the future and then come back and apply what you've been thinking to what we do today. There's, in terms of that imagination and that sense of hope, we have these stirrings both from the health. This is about so-called healthy settings, so homes and schools and workplaces, universities, hospitals, communities, cities, markets, prisons. They're all settings. They're all physical places and social spaces. And within those, we're seeing a lot of interest in the greening of those settings. So when we work in healthy schools or healthy communities or health care, we talk about how do we green these facilities as part of health promotion, as part of what we do in health promotion. And from the other side, you get people working in greening who are talking about healthy parks and healthy people, or watersheds and health, which is the area of work that Margot Parks covers, or airsheds and health, foodstuffs and health. And so there's this real overlap between the health and the environment that we need to exploit, particularly in the settings approach. I'm just going to hop on to this one in the interests of time. So when it comes to hope, what we were looking for is what are the signs of hope? It's not all completely hopeless. There are things, good things, that we can point to and that we can build on and build from. And I really liked this definition that came from a couple of my colleagues writing actually about Medicare in a newspaper article. And hope is the commitment to positivity in the face of adversity. We are definitely in the face of adversity. So how do you find positivity within that? And we thought there were several different ways to do that, to find hope. And the first is that there are health co-benefits to a more sustainable society and a more sustainable community. And it's a point I've been making for years and written about in terms of healthy communities, insisting that a healthy community must be a sustainable community, and that a sustainable community is going to be good for health. And we need to understand they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So there's all sorts of health co-benefits we can point to for shifting to a more sustainable society, and that makes that shift more useful, and being able to estimate what some of the health benefits of a sustainable energy system or a sustainable food system are is a very good way to help make the case for why you need to go there. Secondly, we've done this before. If you were to go back to Manchester in the 1840s and look at those early industrial cities, you would have despaired. You would have despaired at the possibility of ever doing anything about this disastrous mess. If you go back to Manchester 50 years later, 100 years later for sure, huge changes. And we, to a very great extent, learned how to deal with industrialization and fix many of its problems, certainly in the cities, through basic public health and sanitary engineering, clean water and sewage, and things like building codes. Why do we have building codes? Building codes were created for reasons of public health, to stop buildings falling down, catching fire, being dangerous to the inhabitants. That was the prime reason why we developed them, and so on. So we learned how to do that. More recently, a very good example is tobacco control. There'd have been people smoking in here, and it wouldn't have been thought unusual 30 or 40 years ago. No one would dream of smoking in here now. We've changed the social norm on smoking within 2 generations, very dramatically. So we know how to do this. We've taken on corporate power. The tobacco business is a big business, and we've largely, not yet fully, defeated it, pushed it back. We know how to do this. We've done it before. We're not alone is a third reason for hope, that all those other folks that are out there doing this in public health, and for public health, but not as public health. So the environmental movement is full of allies, full of partners that we can work with, all the people who are creating the transition. Fourthly, and it's kind of depressing at one level, but it's empowering at another, we know what needs to be done. We've known for a very long time. I was first involved in this kind of work in the early 70s. There's really nothing we're talking about today that we didn't largely have a handle on 40 years ago, and that we didn't largely know what needed to be done 40 years ago. We've largely lost those 40 years, not fully, but largely. But we don't have to go out and invent something new. We know what needs to be done. We can pick that up and work with it. And in fact, we've made progress. And so while I say we haven't done anything for 40 years, that's not true. Lots of things have changed. Lots of movements have come and gone. Lots of awareness has happened. This is not a good time to be from a country like Canada or Australia in the face of blind and self-willed ignorance of climate change. We actually have it worse than you, because we have as a Prime Minister Tony Abbott with brains, which makes him much more dangerous. So we know that we've got some big struggles ahead. But lots of things are happening, particularly at the local level. And I've always maintained that while globally when I look at what's happening, I may be pessimistic, I look locally and I find all sorts of signs of hope. And I think change has to happen largely from the bottom up, which doesn't mean we should ignore what needs to happen up here and try and change it. I'm not going to go into some of this. I'm going to skip a couple and go right to the public health agenda, because I want to finish with that and have time for some discussion. So I mentioned earlier, this is the kind of, I did a hand sketch of this model earlier. So this is simply, we're saying if we need, that public health needs to understand this framework, and this needs to be what a population health framework looks like in simple terms. And we need to understand the eco-social interaction that drives population health. So, sorry, this is that model. I could see it here and you couldn't see it there. Sorry about that. So then we move on to our action agenda. We have 9 action items that we identified, big ones, focused largely on what is public health going to do. And that's what I think is important. What I want to end with is, what are we going to do to bring to this issue and contribute what we can. Again, focusing initially within our own house. So the first is we need to expand the concept of public health ethics. We need to bring in ideas of intergenerational equity, of interspecies equity, of environmental justice, that largely are not within our codes of ethics within the health professions. We need to bring in an approach that is both anthropocentric, still. I'm trained as a physician. I was trained to be anthropocentric. I have a concern for the well-being of people, not surprisingly. But you have to also have a concern for the well-being of other species. It's not either or. So those are some of the issues. So how do we get those into the codes of ethics? How do we amend the codes of ethics of the College of Surgeons or the College of Nurses or whatever, so that that becomes an expectation of the way you practice? Then we need to understand and address the ecological determinants of health within our own profession, which means, how do you get it into curriculum? How do you get it into exams? How do you get it into certification? No public health practitioner any longer should be able to qualify without a good understanding of this, of what I've been talking about, and some ideas about how to apply it. And that should become part of the core requirements of being a public health practitioner. We're not there yet, but we need to go there. We need to also walk the talk. Public health is largely these days within healthcare systems. I happen to think that's wrong. I think public health belongs in municipal government. But since it is within health systems by and large, we need to walk the talk. We can't go out there and say to municipalities and say to communities, you need to be environmentally responsible, when we don't do it. And the healthcare system is notoriously environmentally irresponsible. Hasn't set out to be, but that's the consequence of the way it behaves. Very energy intensive. Hospitals are among the most energy intensive users in the community. Only industry, heavy industry, gets bigger and more energy intensive than them. Huge producers of solid waste, huge users of water and other resources, huge producers of greenhouse gas emissions in all sorts of ways. And so how do we become, which is why I was involved in starting the Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare, how do we become environmentally responsible before we go out and tell anybody else to do it? I've already talked about we have an experience in changing social norms and values. How do we bring that experience here, and what do we have to do to bring that here? How do we change what we measure? Right now, sometimes, and quite often, you will see in population health or community health reports not only health status measures, but health determinants measures. But they're largely social and economic determinants measures. They're not ecological determinant measures. And they need to be in there too, so that you shouldn't report on the health of your community without reporting on the state of its ecosystem or ecosystems. So what's happening to the fish in the river and the birds in the trees and the food sources and all of that. That should be a standard part of public health reporting. Right now it isn't. So we need to change that. We also need to change how we measure progress. GDP, the only thing you can say about GDP as a measure of progress is that it's gross. It's really gross. It's so stupid. From a health point of view, if we want to increase GDP, we need to get more people smoking, and we need to have better and more expensive ways of treating their tobacco-related disease, because both will add to GDP. I mean, how stupid is that? So forget GDP. How do we measure progress? And what I talk about, particularly with local governments, but it's true all the way up, is we're not here on Earth to grow an economy, surely. We're here to grow people as a society. The main outcome of governance and of governments should be improved human potential and human development for all. Health, if you like, but it's bigger than health. That's how we should measure progress. And the interesting thing is, that's how municipalities do it. How many municipalities do you know whose prime measure of progress is the GDP? I don't know of any. How many states or provinces or national governments do you know whose prime measure of progress is the GDP? Every damn one of them. So we need to actually get the higher levels of government to pay attention to how municipalities measure progress, because they measure quality of life and vital signs and things like that, livability in Melbourne or whatever it may be. So how we measure progress, we need to be involved in ethical purchasing and ethical investment, and that includes divestment. The health system, health folks are beginning to get that. The Canadian Medical Association recently voted to divest its pension fund from fossil fuels, and that's happening elsewhere too. So that's part of it. Ethical purchasing, particularly around green healthcare. Protection of people and communities from harm is sort of conventional public health work, but this is a different level of harm that we need to be protecting them from, but it's still protecting people from harm. It is what we do in public health. We just need to recognize new and emerging global ecological changes as threats that we need to protect people from, which means protecting them from those adverse impacts. Within that, we also need to use existing public health legislation, or we need to craft new public health legislation. Depending on which country you're in or which state or province you're in, you may have quite useful powers within the Public Health Act to address some of these issues. If you recognize, for example, fossil fuels, if you recognize coal as a threat to health, theoretically at least, and legally in our system, our medical officer of health would have the power to shut down a coal mine, I think, on the grounds that it was a threat to public health. The Ontario Public Health Act says where the medical officer of health believes on reasonable and probable grounds that a threat to health may exist, they may take action, or they should take action to remove that threat, or words to that effect. Well, coal mines fit that quite nicely. And then finally, we have to work with others to establish the policies and practices that will create more ecologically sustainable and healthy communities, and that's where I want to end. So I think that, as I've said quite a bit, it's that local action that really matters. So what is the local action that we can take together, and how do you, if you're in public health, how do you engage with your community to make it a more healthy and sustainable community. If you're not in public health, how do you bring public health into the work you're already doing to create more sustainable communities, and realize that healthy and sustainable are two sides of the same coin? And that's the work that we're trying to get public health to engage in going forward. So thank you.